Good morning, everyone. Having spent more than 50 years associated with the United States Navy, I'm a little concerned to be leading off this conference at the National Museum of the U.S. Army, especially after the way you treated us in Philadelphia last December. But my job this morning is to be the setup man. I'm going to talk about the background and the run-up to the invasion, the operational aspects of which will be discussed by others. This conference is entitled D-Day, 1944, and as you surely already know, the term D-Day is a generic one. It refers to the day that any operation anywhere in the world is executed. There was a D-Day in Africa, there at the top left, in Sicily on the right, as well as at Iwo Jima at the bottom left, Okinawa, and elsewhere in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and elsewhere. Indeed, each of these operations not only had a D-Day, they also had an H-hour, the time of the landing. And yet, in the lexicon of war histories, the landing at Normandy, the one we're talking about today, the one that took place on June 6, 1944, has somehow come to be known as the D-Day. Many of the histories of that operation begin with the landing. Think, for example, of the opening scenes of Steven Spielberg's movie Saving Private Ryan. As the movie opens, the landing craft are headed toward the beach. The sea spray wets the soldiers crowded into their little Higgins boats as they make their interminable way toward the beach. And then the ramp drops and Tom Hanks and his fellow soldiers charge out onto that horrible killing ground. It is among, in my opinion, the most realistic war scenes ever filmed. And because it is, it's kind of hard to watch in places. The late Stephen Ambrose once told me that when they screened it for him, he had to ask them to stop the film after 20 minutes because he couldn't see it anymore through his tears. But evocative as that scene is, let me take issue with it. By opening the movie with the landing, it suggests that the beginning of the D-Day operation was here. And yet before this could happen, long before the men climbed down into their landing craft and those landing craft headed for the beach, several other things had to happen first. They may have been less dramatic, but they were nevertheless essential, even existential, to Allied victory. First, the Allies had to plan it. Then they had to agree on the location and the timing. Second, they had to secure the command of the Atlantic sea lanes against the U-boat threat. Without that, the 1.25 million American and Canadian soldiers, and more importantly perhaps, their equipment, their supplies, the ammunition, could not have gotten from the United States and Canada to Great Britain for the cross-channel operation. Third, the Allies had to accumulate the ships on which the men and their equipment crossed the Atlantic, and especially the specialized amphibious ships needed to carry them across the channel, land them on an opposing beach, and keep them there. Of all the bottlenecks that threatened the timetable of the invasion, the most critical by far was the availability of shipping. In addition to the literally thousands of ships needed for the transatlantic movement of men and materiel, there was a simultaneous demand for thousands more ships in the Pacific. I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes, but my point here is that when Tom Hanks, standing in for all the other company commanders who participated, landed on Omaha Beach, it's not the beginning of the story. It's the culmination of at least 2 years' worth of planning, building, organizing, preparing, training the invasion force. And that's the story I want to talk about this morning. So, strategy first. Despite all the talk that we still hear about a special relationship and the ties of a common heritage, a common language, obviously a common enemy, the Anglo-American partnership in World War II was also marked by disagreement and tense, sometimes even bitter negotiations, especially on the issue of D-Day. I love this photograph. It was taken on board a British battleship, HMS Prince of Wales, on August 10th, 1941. Note the date, August 10th, 41, still 2 months before Pearl Harbor. So the United States is still a neutral here. And it features most of the players who were involved in the strategic planning and the strategic disagreements about D-Day. There in front are the players who were involved, the principals of the two countries who were involved. FDR on the left, looking characteristically jovial. He had traveled to meet Churchill at an out-of-the-way anchorage off the coast of Newfoundland in a trip that was so secret, the Secret Service did not know about it. Imagine doing that today. Roosevelt had consistently supported Britain in its unequal contest with Nazi Germany from the very beginning and even before the first day of the war, believing that American security interests were inextricably bound up with Britain's survival. He had stretched the law, and some argued even the Constitution, to ensure that the British could hold out. He was able to convince a majority of Americans, barely, to support him on most of these issues, including critically Lend-Lease, the program that allowed Britain to survive those dark days of 1940 and 1941. To FDR's left, your right, as you look at the photo, of course, is Winston Spencer Churchill, looking rather puckish here. The gravel-voiced survivor of 1,000 parliamentary debates and the determined foe of what he always called Nazism, as if the word Nazi derived from the word nausea. Churchill was grateful for all the aid that Roosevelt was able to send him, but what he really wanted was American belligerency. Consequently, at this conference, and in fact throughout the war, Churchill was the supplicant. Roosevelt was the one being wooed. For his part, Roosevelt hoped that the United States could limit its role in this war to being what he famously called the arsenal of democracy. In effect, he hoped the United States could provide the tools of war while Britain and her Commonwealth partners, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, could not only hold out, but eventually win. That hope had become more realistic just 2 months before this photograph, when Hitler stupidly invaded the Soviet Union. Maybe that's why both of these guys seem to be in a good mood here. Now, with British grit, Russian blood, and American money, Hitler might get beaten without the United States having to go to war at all. Churchill, though, wanted more, and in particular, he sought assurance from FDR that if the United States did become an active belligerent, however that might happen, the Americans would agree to focus their considerable energies and wealth on defeating Hitler in Europe. In fact, at this conference, FDR quickly agreed to that. He could do so because of a recent revolution in American war planning. And the man who crafted that revolution is also in this photograph. That's him at the right with all the stripes on his sleeve. That's Admiral Harold Stark, who, as Chief of Naval Operations, is talking to his British counterpart, Royal Navy Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. It was Stark who wrote the decisive 1940 memo that reoriented American strategy from the Pacific to the Atlantic and specifically to Europe, effectively reversing 20 years of American strategic planning. The reason for it is an appreciation that Germany, certainly in 1941, was by far the more consequential, the more dangerous enemy. It had a GDP, for example, 5 times that of Japan. Well, Churchill was thrilled to hear about this reorientation of American planning, of course, but he had another concern, which was American impatience. If Germany was indeed the more dangerous enemy, the American view was likely to be that if the United States became involved in the war, it would invade Nazi-occupied Europe right now, today. Let's go. The man who argued that point of view is in this photo too. It was Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. That's him just over Churchill's right shoulder, talking to, or actually listening to, the American Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, who was about to replace Stark and who was standing directly behind FDR. King might be telling Marshall here, whispering in his ear, don't forget the Japanese. Officially, at least, King bought into the Germany First principle. But he also believed that it would be a mistake to let the Japanese consolidate their victories in the Pacific, especially in the South Pacific, because if they did, any eventual campaign to retake those prizes would be longer and more costly. So Marshall's job in this discussion is twofold, both to convince Churchill that an early invasion of Europe is a good idea and convince King that to make this happen, the war in the Pacific should be pushed onto the back burner. Note the guy in the middle of the photo who was looking rather suspiciously at the conversation between King and Marshall. He seems to be eavesdropping, and in fact probably was. This is Sir John Dill, who remained in Washington throughout the war as a representative of the British Chiefs of Staff. His role was in fact pretty critical, for he was the broker who negotiated the disputes between King and Marshall, between Marshall and Churchill. He is in fact one of the unsung heroes of the whole planning process, and interestingly enough, he's one of the few foreign-born persons to be buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Just for fun, does anybody know who those two guys are behind King talking to one another? They are indeed. Who's the other one? Harry Hopkins and Averill. Harry Hopkins on the left, Averill Harriman on the right. They played pretty critical roles too, and we can discuss that in the Q&A if you're interested. What's missing from this photo, of course, are the Russians. When this photo was taken, the Red Army was bearing the full brunt of the Nazi war machine along a 1,000-mile front from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. It was self-evident to Joseph Stalin that when these two capitalists, imperialists got together to chat, that they did not necessarily have the best interests of the Soviet Union at heart. Stalin suspected, not without reason, that Churchill's reluctance to commit to an early invasion of occupied Europe was at least partly because he was pretty happy with the way things were going. I mean, let's review the bidding. The Nazis are killing communists. Communists are killing Nazis. Why should he be in a hurry to stop any of that? What Churchill was willing to do was carry out small coastal raids against Nazi-occupied France, pinpricks, that he hoped would keep the Nazis off balance. In fact, almost exactly a year after this photo was taken, on August 19th, 1942, a full division of Canadians with some other forces, British, including a few Americans, charged ashore at a place called Dieppe in northern France. It was a disaster, as you know. And if anything, that horrifying misadventure proved, to Churchill's mind at least, that a premature landing in France could be disastrous. It was George Marshall who presented the first serious Anglo-American plan for a full-scale invasion of France, which he thought should take place on the 1st of May, 1943. The British expressed general, if muted, approval, not because they thought this was a good idea. They didn't. But because they didn't want to annoy the rich Americans. Besides, May of 1943 was still 16 months away. At this point, anything could happen between now and then to change the timetable. A more immediate issue for both the British and the Americans was what to do in the meantime. Surely Marshall and the Americans did not intend to sit around twiddling their thumbs for 16 months while they built up the necessary wherewithal for an eventual invasion. Not only would Stalin find that unacceptable, Roosevelt was politically savvy enough to know that impatient American public wouldn't tolerate it either. If an invasion of Europe was not possible until 1943, something else had to happen somewhere in 1942. Well, as King might be saying right here into Marshall's ear, there's always the Pacific. But Roosevelt rejected that. It would be popular with the American public, especially after Pearl Harbor. But of course, it would fatally compromise the Germany first principle. No, there must be some other role that American forces could play in 1942. And unsurprisingly, Churchill had a plan. He argued that the Allies should invade North Africa. Marshall thought that was a terrible idea. First of all, there were no Germans in North Africa. Not a one. It would be the invasion of a French colony, a nominally neutral country with which the United States had diplomatic relations. Can you imagine attacking a neutral country with whom you had diplomatic relations and doing it without warning? What country would do that? Stalin also thought it was a terrible idea. How was attacking France, for God's sake, supposed to take pressure off the Eastern Front? And Marshall had a second concern. He feared that once the Allies committed to the Mediterranean, the gravitational force of war would suck more and more men and resources and supplies and equipment into the Mediterranean until a May 1943 invasion of Europe became impossible. And he was right. The Allied landings in North Africa did lead inexorably to a campaign in Tunisia, where the Allies at least did finally fight some Germans. Rommel's subsequently famous Africa Corps came over to North Africa in response to the American landings. And that led to an invasion of Sicily and then Italy. And long before any of that, it became obvious that exactly as Marshall had feared, the momentum of events had drawn the war fully into the Mediterranean, which is likely what Churchill had in mind all along. So Marshall had been right. The adventure into the Med fatally compromised the invasion of Europe in 1943. But Churchill had been right too. And that is because the extended campaign in North Africa, and particularly the humiliating American defeat at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, demonstrated more clearly than any British argument could have that the Allies, and frankly the Americans in particular, were not ready for the kind of effort necessary to invade northern France in 1943. And there was another critical factor. Launching an invasion of France from England would be possible only if the Allies could somehow get the necessary men and equipment from the United States to Britain. And that required two things: building literally the thousands of ships needed to do it, and defeating the German U-boat threat in the Battle of the Atlantic. You know, in many ways, calling it the Battle of the Atlantic is a misnomer because it was not a single encounter, but a long, tedious, dangerous struggle between German wolf packs and Allied convoys. It lasted from literally the first days of the war in 1939 up to at least the spring of 1943, by which time the Allies had gained the upper hand. That's another reason why a 1943 invasion would have been at best problematic, if not impossible. And how did the United States and its allies win the Battle of the Atlantic? Well, as this slide suggests, grit and determination were certainly part of it, because the Atlantic convoys were hard, bitterly cold, dangerous, and the sacrifices of the merchant marine are often underappreciated. As but one example, the death rate in World War II for merchant mariners in the North Atlantic was 4%. The death rate for U.S. Marines in the Pacific was 3.3%. In addition to that, however, the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic because of America's astonishing productive capability. From the first, the United States built and launched the hundreds of small escort ships, destroyers, destroyer escorts, even smaller escorts the British called corvettes, that provided protection to the convoys. And they even built scores of small escort carriers that gave the convoy commanders eyes in the sky in the critical mid-ocean area. Another factor was that the Allies developed new tools of sea warfare, including a forward-throwing depth-charge launcher called a Hedgehog that enabled the escort ships to take the offensive against the U-boats. The most critical technological breakthrough was almost certainly radar. Radar had existed before the war, but it was very rudimentary, even experimental. Now, under wartime pressure, it improved dramatically. Because the U-boats attacked the convoys at night and on the surface, the Allied possession of radar stripped away their cloak of invisibility and exposed them to attack by the escorts. And as you all know, there was Ultra, the code word for information that the Allies derived from the code-breaking operation at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, north of London. Here's one of the rudimentary analog computers the British developed to help break the German code. Because the role of Ultra was kept secret for so long, when it was finally declassified in the 1970s, there was a tendency among historians of the war to exaggerate its impact. Oh, that's how we won. We read their mail. Not quite. Did not allow the Allies to read the German codes in real time. What it did do was allow them to read just enough to figure out where some of the wolf packs were located and then redirect the convoys around them. But in addition to the new escorts, the new weapons, and even the code breakers, the single most important factor that allowed the Allies to win the Battle of the Atlantic was this. Between 1942 and 1944, the United States was able to build new ships faster than the Germans could sink them. To do that, workers at shipyards like this one, this is the Henry J. Kaiser Shipyard in Portland, Oregon, worked literally around the clock. This photograph is workers on the swing shift, 4 p.m. to midnight, lining up to replace the day shift workers. And they, in turn, would be replaced by those in the night shift who worked from midnight till 8 a.m. And so it went around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By the way, there's a sign just over the entrance gate in this photo. You can't read it here, but here's a close-up. The results were unprecedented. In January 1942, producing a 10,000-ton Liberty ship from keel to launch took 250 days. By December, it took 50 days. The Oregon Shipbuilding Company in Portland, this one, produced one in 17 days. And that inspired the workers at the Richmond Yard in San Francisco Bay to build one in precisely 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Now, that was a publicity stunt, of course, but many yards were able to build a ship from keel to launch in less than 30 days and do it over and over again. Here's a dramatic illustration of that. I love this sequence of photos. I hope you will too. Here is a Liberty ship under construction at the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore in April of 1943. The men are setting up the framing for the keel. Here are some other images of that same ship. This is day 1. Here's day 2. Day 6. Day 10. Day 14. Day 24. And there she goes. The very next day, another frame would be laid in that slip for another Liberty ship. Being able to outbuild the Germans was critical, but it's a brutal calculus because it overlooked the terrible suffering of the merchant marine crews who were lost in the various convoy battles. Nevertheless, once American productivity surpassed German destructiveness, the Nazis knew they could never win the Battle of the Atlantic. In addition to expanding the number of transport and cargo ships, the invasion of Europe also required hundreds of specially designed amphibious ships. And this birthed a whole alphabet soup of specialized craft. LCIs, LCTs, LCVPs, but of all of them, by far the most important and the most consequential was the LST, an acronym for Landing Ship, Tank. Now, the LST was kind of the ugly duckling of the Naval War. It was, in effect, a big self-propelled box shaped more or less like a bathtub. In its big barn-like hold, it could carry 20 Sherman tanks, 30 heavy trucks, or 2,100 tons of cargo, plus as many as 40 jeeps or light trucks up on the weather deck. Because it had a flat bottom, it could steam right up onto the beach, open massive cupboard-like cargo doors, and discharge those tanks and trucks right out onto the sand. A case can be made that the LST was the single most important ship of the Second World War. Never mind carriers, destroyers, battleships, LSTs. To begin with, they were pretty terrible sailors. With their blunt bow to accommodate those doors and the flat bottom, they wallowed badly, even in a calm sea. In any kind of chop, they smacked down heavily on each successive wave with a teeth-rattling thump. One veteran of an LST recalled, and I love this quote, "Some ships go over the waves. Some of them go through the waves. Some even go under the waves. But an LST just clubs them to death." And despite all that, LSTs were absolutely essential to any amphibious landing in the age of armored warfare, and they became the industrial and logistical bottleneck of the Second World War. Most of the LSTs were built, interestingly enough, along the inland rivers of America, especially the Ohio, Here's an LST being launched from the Naval shipyard below Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 400 miles from the ocean. Other LST building sites are even further inland at Evansville, Indiana, and Seneca, Illinois. Who knew? A second problem was that once it became obvious that a 1943 invasion was not possible, many of those shipyards that had been devoted to LST construction were then retooled to build destroyers to fight against the German U-boats. By the time the priority was shifted back to LSTs for a 1944 invasion, it was almost too late, because making such a change is not a matter of just throwing a switch. There are more than 30,000 different component parts in each LST, and they were manufactured all across the country and shipped by rail to the building yard to be assembled. Finally, the LST production program was slowed by arguments over where to send them once they were completed. King and the Navy wanted them in the Pacific for landings on Japanese-held islands from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. Allied forces in the Mediterranean needed them to land at Sicily and Italy. And there were losses to German U-boats as new LSTs crossed the Atlantic to England. They had a maximum speed of 10 knots, which convinced many in the LST crewmen to argue that LST actually stood for Large Slow Target. The result of all this was that by the spring of 1944, there were just not enough LSTs in British waters to ensure a margin of safety for an invasion of northern France. And it got worse. Throughout the winter and spring of 1944, the hundreds of thousands of men who had been transported to Britain for the invasion engaged in almost constant training exercises, many of them conducted at a beach called Slapton Sands on the south coast of England, which is this beach here. In April 1944, so the invasion now only a month away, the Allies prepared to execute Exercise Tiger, a full-scale practice landing on Slapton Sands. That same night, by coincidence, the German commander of a squadron of small torpedo boats called Schnellbooten, or fast boats, roughly the German equivalent of our PT boats, set out from Cherbourg on the French side of the Channel for a patrol. And in the middle of the night on April 18, 1944, the German torpedo boats encountered a convoy of 8 fully loaded LSTs heading for the exercise beach. In a confused battle in pitch darkness, excuse me, the torpedo boats sank 2 of the LSTs and nearly sunk a third, which is this one here. More than 700 Americans lost their lives in this ambush, which is more, by the way, than the actual fighting on Utah Beach just over a month later. But what concerned Eisenhower almost as much was the loss of those 3 LSTs at a time when he had none to spare. He immediately notified the Joint Chiefs he needed 3 more LSTs, but there were none to be had. And even if there were, they would never get there in time. And as a result, D-Day was postponed for 1 month from May 1st to June 1st. So at last, in the first week of June, all the pieces were in place. The first piece of the puzzle was the 1.5 million American soldiers who had been transported across the Atlantic to join their British and Canadian counterparts in southern England. That caused, by the way, not only unprecedented crowding along Britain's southern coast, but also a kind of cultural revolution as the British adjusted to having so many Yanks in their midst. Everybody looks pretty friendly here, of course, but there were tensions associated with the American invasion of Britain. The Americans, for example, were allotted more meat, 12 ounces a day, than British soldiers who got 8 ounces a day, or British civilians who got 4 ounces a day. Americans also got better pay and often strutted into pubs, slapped down a banknote, claimed that they had come over here to pull British chestnuts out of the fire, and complained that the beer was warm. The friction was especially evident in issues concerning black American soldiers. The U.S. Army was not yet integrated in 1943, 1944, and black American soldiers were confined to segregated units and assigned non-combat tasks as cooks and drivers. They camped separately, ate separately, drilled separately, and the British found this kind of appalling. Britain, of course, had no legacy of domestic slavery. There were only about 8,000 black citizens of Britain in the entire British Isles in 1942. The British found all Americans kind of interesting in a lot of ways, but black soldiers were particularly exotic. British girls, as it turned out, were happy to walk out with black American GIs and often preferred their company since they were less pushy and assertive. But scenes like this triggered a furious backlash by white GIs, especially those from the South, who targeted any black man found with a white date. The British were horrified by this, and Eisenhower did what he could to intervene, but in the end, the American tradition of race separation was stronger than either Army discipline or British culture. Orders went out to segregate the pubs, the restaurants, and it's a measure of how desperate the British were to keep American support that they complied with those orders. So here we are in June 1944, all the pieces in place, the men, the trucks, the jeeps, the tanks, especially the ships, and the embarkation began at 171 different embarkation points all around the periphery of Britain. The ships were combat loaded, which means the items that would be needed first had to be loaded last so that they could be available when the troops first went ashore. The vehicles all had to be backed into the big LSTs from the smaller LCTs. Then they had to be tied down to the deck to prevent them from sliding around during the Channel crossing. Eisenhower, Churchill, even King George himself came down to watch. That led to a curious exchange when an American quartermaster named Robert Evans was ticking off the various items being loaded onto LST-27 on his clipboard. A black Rolls-Royce pulled up, and an officer got out wearing the uniform of a Royal Navy 5-star admiral. Evans had been told to note the name of anyone who boarded the ship, which led to this exchange. What is your name, Admiral? Windsor. First name? George. And so it is dutifully recorded that Admiral George Windsor visited the ship. There was, as you probably know, one more final glitch due to the weather, when rather famously Ike had to postpone the landings by one more day. But on June 5th, all the elements of this vast armada put to sea and headed for a rendezvous in mid-channel south of the Isle of Wight. So, having set the table for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, I will leave it to my friend John McManus to get us ashore and see what happens. All right, thank you very much. We've got... Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, I'm told, and there are microphones, one here. You got the only mic? One there? So if you've got a question, raise your hand. Wait for the mic so we can get it on tape, and then we'll go. Let's start down front because he's close, and then there's one behind him over there.
Thank you. As we prepare for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the 80th anniversary of Slapton Sands is
That's correct.
this month.
Yeah.
But I have seen conflicting reports of what the Germans concluded from that. It obviously could have given away a lot more information than it did. Have you ever seen any, German intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you, I've seen contradictory explanations of what the Germans made of that. Remember that the Allies had been conducting practice landings all along the coast. In addition to Exercise Tiger, there was Exercise Duck, Exercise Fox, Exercise Otter, and these have been going on for a couple of months. So one possible conclusion was, well, it's another one. And we still don't know where they're going to land. Or maybe they did it out in mid-channel to take our eyes off the ball at Calais. That's another speculation. But the Germans, frankly, weren't sure. And I don't think the Germans knew how much damage they had inflicted. I mean, remember, it's the middle of the night. They fire these torpedoes into a group of ships. Tracers are flying around. The Schnellbootens speed away. Initially, the Americans thought subs had done it. There were subs out in the channel somehow. And in fact, when they got back, all of the survivors of that ambush were put into a hospital, supposedly to assess their state of mind, but frankly, to keep them from talking to the press. And it was a closely held secret that this had happened at all and was not made public until after the war was over. So the Germans didn't really know how badly they had damaged. They didn't really know how desperate Eisenhower was for replacement LSTs. So it's not much of a satisfactory answer, but I don't think it had a whole lot of impact on German planning or thinking about where and when D-Day might occur. And there was one back there.
Sort of a related question. To what extent how did the Allies hide what they were doing and create confusion about what they were doing? And also kind of a related question, those are some very concentrated groupings of materiel that seem very, very vulnerable from the air. How did they prevent a disaster before?
Yeah, those are two great questions. As you may have heard in the news lately, apparently there's been a decision made, I'm not even sure who made this decision, to present a unit commendation award to the group running Operation Fortitude, the secret army, the non-existent army in East Anglia that was supposed to be the one that invaded Calais. And that's fine, that's appropriate. I will, however, offer this thought, and that is that we Americans, we Allied people, we Westerners, like the idea that we fooled those silly Germans somehow. We could talk more about this in terms of the Mulberry. We like to think, oh, they didn't think we could bring a harbor across the channel, and we did. They didn't think we could make a fake army in East Anglia, but we did. And yes, I think it probably had some impact. Apparently, it convinced Hitler, in part, that the invasion would take place at Calais rather than in Normandy, that Normandy was a feint. But a lot was done. Number one, to confuse the Germans about where the landing would be. And you mentioned the concentration of forces. Remember, they're scattered all over the place in what were called sausage camps, and that's because on the military maps that still exist, I imagine, somewhere in this museum, the areas were drawn with a kind of a sausage-like boundary. Put them all here because there's heavy forestation and other kinds of cover, and of course camouflage over the top. And then only on the night of June the 4th did they begin moving at night without headlights down to the coast for the embarkation. So that's part of it. Hide where they are. Secondly, the Allies had gained mastery of the air by now, which was critical for the invasion anyway, but it was also critical for keeping German snoopers from having a close look at where some of these embarkation ports might be. And then finally, remember I mentioned there were 171 of them, all the way from Northern Ireland and Scotland, all the way around the British coast and back up the other side, because you can't put everybody in one place. And so they all went to sea, often by night, and then congregated in the area south of the Isle of Wight, in area zebra, as it was called, zebra, as the British would say. Aware that exposing the concentration of forces would compromise the invasion, the Allies went out of their way both to disguise the places where they were concentrated, to create this illusion of a fake army in East Anglia, and then finally to move under the cover of absolute air superiority by the Allies. We got one here and then there.
Yes, Craig, I was glad to see you showed a slide of the hedgehogs.
Yeah.
I watched on Netflix about 2 months ago a documentary on the baseball player Yogi Berra. And to my surprise, Yogi was the commander of one of those ships that launched the Hedgehog prior to the invasion at Omaha Beach. And Yogi was wounded, as were essentially all the men on his ship. And then Yogi never talked about it again, and he refused his Purple Heart because he was worried his mother would get a notice that he'd received a Purple Heart and that she'd be very, very worried in St. Louis. But I found something about D-Day that I did not know, that one of the most famous baseball players was there, Yogi Berra.
Yeah, Yogi's quite a guy. Somebody should do a biography of him in the war. In fact, a book could be written about famous American athletes in the war who decided to give up their fat baseball, football contracts and go fight. And Yogi's one of those. It's called a Hedgehog, by the way, because once all of these 70-pound Torpex devices are launched out ahead of the ship, landing in front of the ship, what's left are little spiky protrusions on which they were placed. And the British said, well, that looks just like a hedgehog, a groundhog that comes out from the hedges alongside the road, who were all over Britain. So that, hence the name. Yeah.
Greg, thank you very much for this presentation. As a ground-pounding Army guy, I talk to my students about all of the embarkation points and moving at night in radio silence, all those ships. And I castigate the Navy because they bump into each other today. How did that happen? It might be a simple question for sailors, but for those of us who live the terrestrial life, we find it pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's not simple at all, and it is pretty amazing. I mentioned radar. Radar was available on the larger ships, certainly the command ships, all the bombardment ships, the battleships, and the cruisers. They had radar, but a lot of the smaller ships didn't have this. They had to just kind of look at night, blacked out, to make sure they didn't bump into each other. There was some confusion in Area Zebra. The popular name for it, by the way, once they all congregated south of the Isle of Wight, was Piccadilly Circus, because there were all these ships all going in various locations, and they got separated from their units and couldn't find them, and they're maneuvering around. There were some collisions, though not many. But I have to agree with what you opened with. It's remarkable that they did this. Absent, the kind of navigational devices that allowed me to find this museum from Annapolis. I had to use my phone. Where am I? Where am I going? So, yes, I agree with you. Remarkable. In the back.
I'd like to put a bit of meat on some of the things you've said. In case you haven't noticed, I am not American. Going backwards there, I have parked just down the road here many times, and sometimes my GPS gets thrown 2.5 miles to the southeast, just near a certain little airfield in Fort Belvoir. I wonder why. Anyway, I grew up in a village 9 miles west of Dover. This is not East Anglia, this is Kent. I was born in 1946, so therefore this is not straight from the horse's mouth. It came from people who were involved, people I grew up with. The village had a wood next to it, and during 1944, a company of American soldiers moved into that wood, and their job, I'm guessing, is to run around and look like thousands of American soldiers, part of the deception plan. Because they were not going to fight, they were black. The village was appalled at the way they were treated. The village had 2 pubs, the Bull and the Moor's Head, and it ended up with all white officers being banned by the landlords from going into the pubs, and the villagers opening up their houses to as many black GIs as they could for dinner and lunch and so on. That's a story I grew up with. Now, talking about navigation, I am Royal Navy. I want to just mention COP, Combined Operation Pilotage Parties. They started surveying the French coast in August 1943, principally going across in submarines and then being launched in foldable canoes called foalboats and running lines into the beach to determine sea levels, tidal ranges, and the type of beach. One beach that was principally picked for the potential landing. When they dug under the sand, they found it was peat, and any tanks landing on it would have just sunk straight away. So that work went on all through the autumn and into the winter of 1944 until the end of January. By now, those who were working on the plan were getting a strong sense that Normandy was the target. There were things going on elsewhere, part of the deception. But they were so worried that somebody would be captured that they stopped the surveys in case the secret got out that it was going to be Normandy. On the night of the invasion, COP in their submarines went across first, and then in their foalboats, they laid markers, lights, for the landing craft to follow, pilotage lights, to guide them into the beach. Now, as we probably hear, one of those landings went seriously wrong, and the reason for that is, remember the storm that occurred that delayed the landing? Well, those storms can create extra strong currents. The COP surveys, by necessity, could only be straight lines. Running in, take the soundings. Move down, take the soundings. Take another let of soundings and then get out before you were spotted. So it was very scattered and only done in very narrow, preordained lanes. Along came that storm, and everything sort of shifted in water-wise hundreds of yards down. So we ended up with landing craft not coming in on the surveyed areas, but coming in where they weren't surveyed. And also, because of that storm, some of the shoals further out were enlarged by sediment. There's always a strong current in the English Channel, and that's why some of the tanks came into shallow water, into deep water. But we'll probably hear more about that. And I just want to mention COPs. I knew some of the people who were actually in the Combined Operation Pilotage Parties. Some of them did not survive, of course, but it was a great story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have two questions from our virtual audience. The first one is, how much of the planning was done in the Washington, D.C. area?
In addition to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is a brand new organization, by the way, in World War II, there was nothing in the official organizational charts for the military services to create a Joint Chiefs. It just sort of emerged out of necessity. In addition to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the American heads of services, there's the British Chiefs of Staff, who sent representatives to Washington, one of whom was John Dill, whose photo we saw earlier. And that group was known as the Combined Chiefs of Staff, the British and American Chiefs of Staff, and they were the clearinghouse for the final decisions. A lot of operational decisions are made elsewhere, but the large strategic decisions are made almost exclusively in Washington, D.C. And if they couldn't come to a solution, then members of the Joint Chiefs flew to Britain, staying in the Claridge Hotel, and then actually met with Churchill and the British heads of service to hammer out any things that hadn't been figured out by the Combined Chiefs. But a lot of that planning went on in Washington under the umbrella of the Combined Chiefs of Staff.
Okay, last question, also from online, is how much planning was done for the what next part of this campaign after the landing?
Yeah, quite a bit. The idea is not just, well, we'll get ashore and there, done, we've got it figured out. The idea was to get ashore, and then the first objective was to swing to the right, cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, gain control of Cherbourg, which is a major port where we can then bring in the massive amounts of supplies, reinforcements, equipment, blood plasma, ammunition, all the other things to keep this operation moving. Once the Cotentin Peninsula is cut off and Cherbourg is captured, then it's the big wheel to the left, the Americans on the outside of the wheel, the British and Canadians on the inside of the wheel, to move across France, take Paris, into Berlin, pretty much the way it played out.
Okay, thank
All
you,
right.
Craig.
Thank you very much.